The 2024 presidential election has actually already started, with 61 million votes having already been cast nationally. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election map based on purely the results so far. Before we get started, please smash that subscribe button for more content like this leading up to the 2024 election. We will start on the West Coast, where Washington, Oregon, and California will all go to Kamala Harris by a very solid margin. She holds a double-digit lead in all three of these states, and she will sweep the West Coast this election. Moving on to Alaska, Donald Trump holds a solid lead in this pretty conservative state, in which he also carried by a huge margin in 2020, so Alaska will be solid for Donald Trump. In Hawaii, Democrats hold a 30% lead in early voting, which is huge, even for a solid blue state like Hawaii. We will now be moving on to the completely solid states for each candidate according to early voting results. For Kamala Harris, those states would include Illinois, New York, Vermont, Maine at large, Maine's 1st congressional district, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. For Donald Trump, his solid states would include Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, and West Virginia. These are the completely solid states where both candidates will have a 99% chance of winning. Now, moving back to the early voting graph, we will start north with the state of Minnesota. In Minnesota, Democrats hold a 23% lead on Republicans in early voting, which is huge for the Kamala Harris campaign. If Harris can win Minnesota very early on election night, it will be great signs for her, as an early deliverance of Minnesota will show likely signs of her winning the 2020 election. In neighboring Wisconsin, the Democrats hold a 11% lead in early voting, which is decent for one of the more conservative Rust Belt states. Now, some of you guys may be asking, will Wisconsin go to Kamala Harris by 11%? The answer is no. However, for the purposes of this video, we'll be placing Wisconsin into the likely blue column. Moving on to Michigan, we see that the Democrats hold a 5% lead in early voting, which isn't necessarily the strongest. However, they still do hold an advantage, and with Election Day coming up, the Democratic turnout on Election Day is expected to be huge compared to in the past, such as in 2020. For the purposes of this video, we'll be putting Michigan into the lean blue column. And now, moving on to the keystone state of Pennsylvania, which most people consider the most important state in this election. 1.6 million votes have already been cast in Pennsylvania, and Kamala Harris leads by a good margin of 20%. Now, is this as good as what Biden led by 4 years ago? No. However, you have to consider that 4 years ago, the country was in a pandemic where more people were likely to vote by mail and vote early. In the end, I predict that Kamala Harris will win Pennsylvania by a very slight margin of under 1%. However, for the purposes of this video, Pennsylvania will be in the solid blue column. And with the Rust Belt now sorted out, Kamala Harris stands at a whopping 237 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 112 electoral votes. Moving on to the state of Iowa. Taking a look at the early voting results in Iowa, we see that the Democrats actually hold a 4% lead. Now, do I think the Democrats will win Iowa? No. However, the fact that they're leading in early voting just shows how poorly Trump is performing in states that he won by 7% back in 2020. And according to the early voting results in Iowa, the Democrats do hold a slight lead, giving them Iowa and its 6 electoral votes as of now. We will now be filling out the likely states for each candidate. These are states that candidates have an 80% chance of winning, and their expected margin of victory is around 10 to 15%. For Kamala Harris, those states would include Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia, New Hampshire, and the 2nd Congressional District of Nebraska. For Donald Trump, his likely states would include Indiana, Ohio, and Nebraska at large. We will now be moving down south at the Sun Belt, starting with the state of Nevada. Taking a look at the early voting results in Nevada, we see that the Republicans hold a slight 4% lead. The Republicans have been doing decent in Nevada since the midterms, winning the governor's election in 2022. However, this is not to count out Kamala Harris, as she still has a great chance of winning in Nevada. However, as of now, Nevada will go into the tilt column for the Republicans. Moving on to the state of Arizona. Taking a look at the early voting results in Arizona, we see that the Republicans lead by 8%. Arizona is another one of those states in which Republicans have been performing pretty well in recently. This is because as of recently, Democratic candidates have been struggling to appeal to Hispanic and Latino voters, which make up a big portion of these southern Sunbelt states. Demographic problems have really cost the Democrats in past elections, such as Florida in 2020. With all of that in mind, Arizona will go to Donald Trump by a tilt margin. Moving on to the state of Texas. Taking a look at the early voting in Texas, we see that Republicans lead by 14%. This honestly comes at no surprise because even though the Democratic Party has made major gains in Texas this past decade, they still haven't come close to being able to carry it in a major presidential election. Because of that, I will be giving Texas to Donald Trump by a likely margin. Moving on to the state of Florida. Taking a look at the early voting in Florida, we see that the Republicans lead by 10%. Florida is an interesting state because unlike many other battleground states in 2020, Florida actually shifted to the right. In 2016, Donald Trump carried Florida by less than 2% against Hillary Clinton. However, in 2020, he actually expanded his lead in Florida up to 3.4%. Now, the reasoning behind this is once again the struggle with Hispanic voters on the side of the Democrats. Hispanic voters make up a major part of the Florida population, and if they can't get these Hispanic voters to vote for them, then they can't win these southern Sunbelt states. However, the good news for the Kamala Harris campaign is that she has been growing her support amongst white voters who are now turning to her and away from Trump. With that in mind, Florida will be competitive, but ultimately, Donald Trump will still pull off the win by a slight margin in Florida. Moving on to the state of Georgia. In Georgia, over 3 million votes have already been cast in this election, making a record early turnout in this state. As of recently, both candidates have been encouraging their voters to go and vote early, leading to this massive turnout in Georgia. Georgia is also one of the most critical states in this election, with Biden barely carrying it by 0.2% back in 2020. Taking a look at the early voting results in Georgia, we see that the Republicans hold just a narrow lead of 3%. Georgia is likely going to be the most competitive state in this election. However, as of now, for the purpose of this video, I will be giving Georgia to Donald Trump by a very slight margin. And now, moving on to the state of North Carolina. This election is one of the most unprecedented elections in North Carolina, with Hurricane Helene, Mark Robinson, and many other major factors playing a role in this election. For some historical context, North Carolina has always been a conservative state that's always been very competitive, and this time, Democrats are looking to flip it. Taking a look at the early voting results in North Carolina, we see that the Republicans lead by just 1%. If Kamala Harris can win North Carolina, then not only will she win the election, but she will also carry many other battleground states because of North Carolina's background. As of today, Trump does lead by a very slight margin, but things could change if Democrats were to show out on election day. Nevertheless, Donald Trump does hold a very, very slight lead in North Carolina, so I will be giving North Carolina to Donald Trump by a tilt margin. And for our final state, the 2nd Congressional District of Maine. This district voted for Donald Trump by 7% in 2020, and he is on track to win it again. And that is the 2024 election map based on early voting results so far. This really is an unprecedented election, with 61 million votes already being cast across the nation. Thank you guys so much for watching, and please smash that subscribe button for more content like this leading up to the 2024 election.